Hello, Marvel fans, comic geeks, and all nerds in between. My name is Megan, and I'm here with a character breakdown that I have been working on. I think I started it at the end of November of last year, and it's such a big episode. It's such a big character. So please watch this because it's going to be so much editing, and I'm not looking forward to it. We're going to talk about Jean Grey. I thought, what better time is there to talk about Jean than now? To be honest with you, I didn't know if anyone would be into this episode just because I feel like plenty know Jean. But do you know Jean? Like, she has a wild background, and we're going to go through all of it. So, I hope you like this episode. So, Jean Grey, this iconic character who has been through just about every mutant issue one can imagine. Her first appearance, she starts all the way from the beginning in X-Men #1 in July of 1963, and that's when she arrived as Marvel Girl. Then, in The Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix #4 in June of 1994, that was her first debut as Phoenix. So, Jean Grey is the second daughter of college professor John Grey and his wife Elaine. Growing up, she and her older sister Sarah were basically inseparable. Unfortunately, Jean's childhood takes a hard left turn at age 10 when she's hanging out with her best friend Annie Richardson, who gets hit by a car. As Annie dies in Jean's arms, Jean's mutant telepathy decides that is the perfect time to activate, and causing her to accidentally experience Annie's death firsthand, which is a genuinely terrible first day on the job as one of the most iconic mutants in the world. Needless to say, Jean becomes deeply traumatized. She withdraws from everyone while also getting bombarded by everyone else's thoughts 24/7 because her brain apparently forgot where the mute button was. Her parents drag her to every psychiatrist they can find, but nobody can figure out what's wrong. Eventually, they call the family friend Charles Xavier. You know, that Charles Xavier, who uses his telepathy to put mental blocks in Jean's mind so her powers don't completely steamroll her before she's old enough to control them. Jean becomes one of Xavier's first students, and while teaching her telekinesis, he realizes she's not just powerful, she has the potential to become an Omega level mutant because she's built different. But also, I should mention, Xavier was super weird with Jean. He had a major crush on her, and it was weird and it didn't need to happen. But that just goes into when I always say that Xavier is the main villain of the X-Men. So, because he's also super creepy. During one training session, Jean senses another lonely mutant mind reaching out. With Xavier's help, she discovers it's Scott Summers, aka Cyclops. Scott joins Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters, and sometime after that, Jean officially enrolls, and together they become founding members of the X-Men, with the other founding members of the X-Men, a group of teenagers whose extracurricular activity is saving the world from mutant terrorists instead of, going to prom. It was also super weird when Jean is finally brought into the X-Men when it's already a boys' club because she is immediately hit on by everyone there. Iceman is there, Cyclops. It was a lot. So, good for her for standing her ground. So, really quick, let's talk about what Jean can actually do. Jean's telepathy is absolutely ridiculous. She can read minds, project her thoughts into other people's heads, create psychic links, control people's actions, knock enemies out with psychic blasts, create nearly flawless illusions, walk around the astral plane like it's another Tuesday. She can juggle countless minds at once, though fully taking over someone else's mind only works one person at a time and only if they're nearby. Every now and then she plugs into Cerebro or its upgrade Cerebra because apparently her normal brain isn't overpowered enough. Then there's her telekinesis. Jean can fly, make other people fly whether they want to or not, toss around basically anything, manipulate matter by increasing molecular friction, create force fields, and fire telekinetic blasts strong enough to flatten just about anyone having a bad day. And then there's the Phoenix Force. When the Cosmic Firebird chooses Jean, the power scaling goes completely off the rails. She gains total molecular control over matter, can reshape atomic structures on a universal level, create seemingly limitless energy, absorb things as absurd as supernovas, turn herself into pure energy, survive basically anywhere in existence, bend space and time, travel through hyperspace, and her telepathy somehow gets even stronger. Whenever she's really cutting loose, a giant flaming cosmic bird appears around her because subtlety is for other superheroes, not Jean. The Phoenix can also resurrect people under certain conditions, absorb life force to fuel itself, and because death is apparently more of a suggestion than a rule for Jean Grey, it repeatedly brings her back whenever she dies. And she dies a lot, just so you know. Eventually, after one of her many deaths, Jean fully merges with the Phoenix Force itself, becoming connected to the universal force of life born from every living mind in existence. Because why stop at a really strong mutant when you can just become cosmic life itself? Outside of punching reality in the face, Jean is also an accomplished pilot, a skilled teacher, an experienced fashion model, and has trained in psychology. She's genuinely one of the most well rounded people on the team, which is impressive considering half of her coworkers communicate through eye lasers. As an X Man, Jean spends years fighting basically every nightmare imaginable. Magneto and the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, Mr. Sinister and his obsession with her DNA, Apocalypse, the Demon Nightmare, the Shadow King, and plenty of other people who wake up every morning and choose violence. She dies more than once, including at the hands of Zorn and the anti-mutant group Orchis. But thanks to the Phoenix Force or mutant resurrection via the Five, death rarely sticks around for long. It's much more of just an inconvenience. Jean's relationship with the Phoenix is complicated, which I feel like everyone's who's harnessed the Phoenix Force, their relationship is also complicated. So I think the Phoenix is the problem. So the cosmic entity feeds off her rage and desire, possesses her, copies her, impersonates her, resurrects her, and occasionally convinces her to do catastrophically bad things, like trying to kill her friends or destroying an entire planet. Eventually, Jean decides she's done being the Phoenix's favorite emotional support Apocalypse and rejects its control. Growing into adulthood, Jean remains one of Professor X's star students and founding member of the original X-Men alongside Cyclops, Iceman, Angel, and Beast. She and Jean quickly become best friends. Jean also helps found X-Factor with Scott and several other X-Men. Speaking of Scott, Jean and Cyclops have one of comics' most exhausting romances in the world. They're deeply in love, except whenever one of them is dead, believed dead, possessed, cloned, time displaced, or emotionally unavailable because of the latest world ending crisis. Somehow, all of those things happen multiple times. During one period where Jean was presumed dead, Scott marries her clone, Madeline Pryor, the Goblin Queen, or as I call her, Maddie the Baddie, and they have a son named Nathan. Then Jean comes back, and Madeline goes off the rails, and Jean and Scott end up raising Nathan together in the future for over a decade because comic books have absolutely no respect for a normal family tree. Things get messier when Emma Frost helps Scott recover from the Apocalypse's possession, and that professional therapy turns into a psychic affair. Jean and Emma literally throw hands inside each other's minds before eventually reaching an uneasy respect. Meanwhile, Wolverine spends decades hopelessly and annoyingly in love with Jean. While she clearly loves Scott, and Wolverine does not love Scott, there are definitely moments where Logan complicates everyone's emotional health. Beyond the X-Men, Jean frequently teams up with the Avengers and the Fantastic Four whenever Earth collectively decides it's having another extinction-level event. Jean originally debuts publicly as Marvel Girl when the X-Men stop Magneto from taking over Cape Citadel Missile Base. Around this time, Mr. Sinister secretly clones her using stolen DNA, although the clone initially remains comatose because apparently even evil science has loading times. Early X-Men adventures include battles with the Vanisher, the Blob, Magneto's Brotherhood, and Namor, while Jean and Scott slowly dance around admitting that they like each other, despite everyone else already figuring it out. Years later, everything gets weird, as it tends to do, but it gets weird even by X-Men standards. The younger Beast travels back in time and convinces the original teenage X-Men to come to the future to stop adult Cyclops from becoming a whole mutant problem with his, optic blasts. Instead, they discover Professor X is dead, Jean herself is dead, temporarily, as I've mentioned, and the school is named after her. Cyclops has become a revolutionary, Magneto is somehow his ally, and Beast is dying from yet another mutation. Since Xavier is gone, Jean's old psychic blocks disappear, causing her powers to evolve much earlier than they originally did. Rather than return home, the young X-Men decide to stay and try fixing the timeline. Angel votes no. Everyone else basically says, too bad. Without Xavier's limits, teenage Jean starts using her telepathy creatively. She manipulates Angel into staying, joins Cyclops' revolutionary school, and generally makes choices that leave everyone asking, Jean, maybe don't. Emma Frost and the Stepford Cuckoos eventually step in and tell her to knock it off. Jean also unlocks the ability to create psychic illusions, repeatedly runs into Rachel Summers, her own daughter with Scott from a different timeline, and avoids that incredibly awkward conversation. While training with Future Beast, she accidentally reads his thoughts and discovers he'd had a crush on her. Instead of pretending she didn't hear it like a normal person, she immediately confronts him, insists on total honesty, and they end up sharing a kiss. These are the things that piss me off about Jean. You know that? What, you didn't know he didn't like you? The first day he met you, he kissed you on the cheek? Get over yourself. Because X-Men relationships are contractually obligated to be complicated and annoying. Soon after, the Shi'ar Empire kidnaps Jean, puts her on trial for crimes committed by her future self as the Phoenix. The X-Men, Guardians of the Galaxy, and the Starjammers all rush to rescue her. But Jean ends up rescuing herself by unlocking another massive jump in her telepathic and telekinetic abilities. She points out that everyone keeps blaming her for a future literally no one managed to prevent, and calls out the hypocrisy of putting one person on trial for a cosmic force's actions, then proceeds to defeat Gladiator, the Shi'ar Empire's strongest warrior. Cyclops arrives just in time to dramatically tell the Shi'ar to leave Earth alone, and for once they actually listen. When the Terrigen Mist roll in across Earth, things got really bad for mutants. The clouds were toxic to them, killing many and throwing mutant kind into chaos. During all this, the time-displaced original X-Men split up, and Jean decided to try something almost unheard of in superhero comics. Just go to college. That normal life did not last long. Storm put together a team to deal with the mutant crisis, and Jean joined without hesitation. Once the Terrigen cloud was finally destroyed, Beast invited her back into the X-Men. Jean accepted, only to learn the odds of the original team ever returning to their own time were basically non-existent. At that point, the teenage X-Men realized that they weren't just visiting the future anymore. They were stuck there, meaning they'd have to stop worrying about preserving history and start making one of their own. Refusing to let destiny steamroll her the way it had her older self, Jean decided that she was done following someone else's script. While visiting Kyoto, she saved innocent civilians from the wrecking crew because apparently supervillains refuse to let anyone enjoy sightseeing. And it's not much to ask. Right afterward, she started having terrifying visions of the Phoenix Force coming back for her. Having learned absolutely nothing from everyone else's Phoenix horror stories would have been a mistake. So Jean tracked down several former hosts to ask, so, hypothetically speaking, how do you not become a cosmic disaster? Which is the question everyone wants to start their day with. Along the way, she developed a powerful new telekinetic construct, expanding her abilities even further. Still searching for answers, Jean turned to Doctor Strange, who confirmed the voices in her head weren't her imagination this time. They belonged to the spirit of the adult Jean Grey from the present timeline, the one who had died years earlier. Because if you're Jean Grey, ghost versions of yourself is just a normal day. Like this, the day's probably going to get weirder. Younger Jean kept quiet about the incredible power she knew the adult Jean would have one day. Apparently, this was important enough that Uatu, the Watcher, showed up just to silently observe events from the sidelines, which is his favorite hobby. If you don't know the Watcher, he's a watcher. Back in the present, things somehow became weirder. Adult Jean's spirit had taken over Emma Frost's body and asked her younger self to explore Emma's mind. Inside, Jean discovered a hidden fragment of the Phoenix Force, and in what was probably not the safest decision she ever made, she absorbed it into herself. The power nearly overwhelmed her. Thankfully, several powerful telepaths stepped up to help, and Hope Summers, the mutant messiah, and somehow Jean's future adoptive step-granddaughter, because the Summers family tree is less of a tree and more of a tangled extension cord, provided Jean with a psychic weapon called the Psi-Miter. Psi-Miter, I think. Jean actually managed to wound the Phoenix. The Phoenix responded by immediately burning her alive. The Phoenix is not nice. If you've learned anything from me, just know the Phoenix is not a kind entity. Jean woke up in the white hot room and the mystical nexus connecting every Phoenix host across time and space. It serves as both the Phoenix's home and its waiting room for people who have technically died but probably won't stay that way. The Phoenix intended to resurrect the adult Jean Grey there, but teenage Jean quickly realized she actually had authority inside the white hot room. Instead of accepting her fate, she basically told the Phoenix, "Actually, bring me back." Shockingly, it listened. Jean was restored to life, returned to school, and even got to meet her newly resurrected adult counterpart. Awkward family reunions don't usually involve alternate versions of yourself, but the Grey family has different standards. Not long after, the young X-Men found themselves battling Eddie Brock, who is with Venom, because every superhero has to deal with symbiotes at some point. It's just a way of the land. Jean briefly bonded with one herself before being assimilated by one of the poisons, transforming into Poison Marvel Girl. Thankfully, she broke free, killed the Poison Queen, and reunited with her teammates before anyone had to explain why there were suddenly two hive minds trying to ruin everyone's day. And that story ended, which was great. Then came more time travel. The teenage X-Men jumped through time and encountered alternate versions of themselves, except they weren't alternate versions at all. They were actually the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants impersonating them. The experience made the team realize that if they didn't return to the exact instant they'd originally left the past, the Brotherhood could take their place and completely derail history. As if that wasn't enough, mutant hunting time traveler Ahab showed up to make everyone's lives worse, which is what he does. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you feel about the Summers family time travel, a young version of Cable arrived and insisted the teenage X-Men absolutely had to return to their original timeline. If they stayed in the future, reality was heading toward an incredibly ugly outcome. Before sending them home, Cable took the team 5 years into Ahab's past to rescue two children who would eventually become his mutant hounds, Maxine and Manon. Jean quickly realized the kids were not monsters at all. They were just children who hadn't been twisted by Ahab. While talking to Manon, Jean even learned how to plant memories into people and control when those memories surfaced, adding another frighteningly useful trick to her already absurd psychic toolkit. Of course, Ahab eventually caught up with them because villains apparently have unlimited GPS tracking. It is wild, but I don't ask questions, I just read them. Realizing they were out of time, young Cable sent Jean and the original X-Men back to the exact moment they had first disappeared from history. Before the timeline snapped back into place, Jean erased all of her teammates' memories of their adventures into the future. Once the time loop closed, however, those memories would naturally pass on to their older selves, preserving history without creating any paradoxes. Comic books are weird. Back in their original timeline, Jean and the other original X-Men finally graduated from Xavier School. Her parents enrolled her at Metro College, though she never stopped being an X-Man. There, she befriended fellow student Ted Roberts, whose brother Ralph eventually became the armored villain Cobalt Man. Naturally, Ted's family drama ended with the X Men having to save the day. Meanwhile, Professor X was secretly preparing for the impending invasion of alien Xenox. To do that, he planned to fake his own death by having the mutant shapeshifter Changeling impersonate him. Since the disguise needed to fool telepaths as well as everyone else, Xavier removed the psychic blocks he'd placed in Jean's mind years earlier, finally giving her unrestricted access to her full telepathic abilities. He also enlisted Jean's help in teaching Changeling how to convincingly imitate Xavier's psychic presence. Unfortunately, Changeling was later killed battling the subterranean warrior Grotesque. To keep Xavier's larger plan intact, Jean helped sell the lie by publicly mourning Xavier as though he truly died. No one knew. The other X-Men had no idea. So Xavier made her keep this secret to herself, even from Cyclops or Angel. Xavier's a villain. I'll never stop. The X-Men temporarily disbanded as part of Xavier's strategy to avoid distractions while preparing for the Xenox invasion. During this downtime, Jean finally started dating Scott Summers, although part of their relationship served as convenient cover for her growing career as a fashion model and photographer's favorite subject. Eventually, the team reunited, met Scott's long-lost brother Alex Summers, better known as Havoc, and just when everyone had finally accepted Xavier's death, Professor X casually rolled through and revealed he'd been alive the entire time. The students were understandably less than thrilled. With the truth finally out, Xavier resumed leading the X-Men as they united once more to stop the Xenox invasion to save Earth. Honestly, for the X-Men, this counted as a relatively normal semester. Then, starting out as a fairly standard X-Men week, which in comic book terms means fighting the Hulk, bumping into Magneto, hanging out in the Savage Land, bringing in Storm, stopping another weather mutant, and helping the Fantastic Four save reality again. Totally normal. On the way to dealing with the Xenox, Jean Grey had her first encounter with the Phoenix Force, which, if you don't know, is an ancient cosmic being made basically of all cosmic energy ever. It had apparently been quietly stalking her since birth because it looked at baby Jean and went, "Ooh, I want that one." It briefly touched her mind, then disappeared. For now. Then things somehow got weirder. Jean and the original X-Men were captured by the sentient mutant island Krakoa, which decided people were a perfectly acceptable food source. Xavier sent a rescue team, and let me tell you, this is another reason why Xavier is a villain, including another one of Scott Summers' long-lost brothers, Gabriel, who is Vulcan, who got absolutely wrecked. Half the team was presumed dead, so Xavier's solution was just to erase everyone's memories of them. Healthy coping mechanism. Super healthy to do to the brother of the guy that just died, that Xavier, you sent on a suicide mission. So, there's that. He recruited another team of X-Men who actually succeeded in rescuing the originals. Jean also met Wolverine, who immediately developed a crush on her because apparently that's just a law in Marvel Universe, that everyone has to have a thing for Jean Grey, but Wolverine is different. He never stopped. It's all that man, his obsession was it was a lot. After finally getting home, Jean decided she'd earned a break from the superhero life, which is fair. She moved in with private investigator Misty Knight and became best friends with Storm as soon as Storm joined the team. It was pretty instantaneous. That peaceful phase lasted maybe 5 minutes. Because remember, this is comic books. While on a Christmas date with Scott, which already feels like tempting fate, Jean, Wolverine, and Banshee were kidnapped by Sentinels and imprisoned aboard creator Stephen Lang's orbital space station. The X-Men escaped by stealing a space shuttle, except the cockpit's radiation shielding was destroyed. Human pilot Peter Corbeau would have died during the re-entry, so Jean copied all of his piloting knowledge with her powers and flew the shuttle herself, figuring her telekinesis would protect her. It did not. Jean was blasted with enough cosmic radiation to kill her, which is what attracted the Phoenix Force. It basically floated over and said, You want me to take over? Or Jean agreed to let it save her. The Phoenix Force placed her real body inside a healing cocoon at the bottom of Jamaica Bay. Copied her body, carried part of her consciousness into the duplicate, and went back to pretending to be Jean Grey. Nobody, not even X-Men, noticed the swap. They just assumed the radiation had given Jean a massive power upgrade and welcomed her as the Phoenix. Unfortunately, absolute cosmic power and human emotions are not a great combination. Manipulated by Mastermind and the Hellfire Club, Phoenix slowly lost her grip on reality, becoming the Dark Phoenix, and even briefly served as the Hellfire Club's Black Queen. She eventually broke free of their influence and immediately flew into space and ate an entire star. The problem with eating stars is that planets tend to orbit them. Billions of innocent Dabari died because their sun literally disappeared. After fighting the X-Men, the fragment of Jean's consciousness still inside the Phoenix resurfaced and forced the Phoenix Force to destroy its own body rather than continue existing as a universal catastrophe. Everyone believed Jean Grey had sacrificed herself to save the universe, except the real Jean was still asleep underwater. The Phoenix Force tried to return Jean's missing life essence, but when healing Jean experienced visions of everything Phoenix had done in her name, she subconsciously rejected it. Since the Force was still genetically keyed to Jean, it instead latched onto one of Mr. Sinister's comatose Jean Grey clones. Congratulations. Accidental clone activation. The clone woke up as Madeline Pryor, unknowingly became part of Sinister's long-term breeding program involving Scott Summers, fell in love with Scott, married him, and eventually had their son Nathan. Meanwhile, years later, the Avengers accidentally discovered Jean's cocoon at the bottom of Jamaica Bay. Reed Richards cracked it open, Jean woke up, escaped, and unintentionally damaged her own telepathy in the process. Returning home, she discovered she'd apparently been dead, while another version of her had become a cosmic god, destroyed a solar system, died heroically, and traumatized literally everyone she knew. Honestly, she'd had better vacations. Learning that she'd unknowingly influenced the Phoenix Force to stop itself gave Jean some peace. She reunited with Angel, Beast, Iceman, and Scott, who conveniently forgot to mention he'd marry someone else and had a baby. Great boyfriend material. But to be fair, I mean, it was a clone, so is it a different person? Is it cheating if it's a clone? And you don't know it's a clone? I ask myself this a lot. Together, they formed X Factor, publicly pretending to hunt mutants while secretly rescuing and training them. Eventually, Jean found out about Scott's wife and son and was understandably furious that everyone kept it from her. Around the same time, Angel was nearly killed during the Morlock massacre. Anti-mutant violence escalated. Jean's sister, Sarah, became a mutant rights activist, and Jean narrowly escaped a hate crime firebombing at Sarah's home. X Factor eventually dropped the fake Mutant Hunters Act and openly became superheroes. Things got even messier when Mr. Sinister decided Madeline had outlived her usefulness. After surviving multiple assassination attempts, Madeline reunited with the X-Men without telling Scott she was alive. Scott, meanwhile, convinced himself Jean must secretly be Phoenix. Jean's response was essentially, I was literally in a pod. The disagreement escalated into a full superhero fight that only stopped because Leech temporarily shut off everyone's powers. Leech is amazing, by the way, if you don't know his game. Soon after, Apocalypse entered the picture. During the battle, the team discovered Angel hadn't died at all. He'd been transformed into Apocalypse's metal-winged horseman, Death. Thankfully, Angel fought through the brainwashing and returned to X Factor. Jean and Scott reconciled, but then watched what appeared to be the televised death of both the X-Men and Madeline, making their relationship somehow even more confusing. Then baby Nathan disappeared. Jean and Scott tracked him down to an orphanage where Scott had grown up and discovered a secret laboratory underneath, fought Nanny, Orphan Maker, and an army of brainwashed mutant children, including Jean's own niece and nephew, and still failed to stop demons that kidnapped Nathan. Why? Because Madeline Pryor was alive. Now corrupted by a limbo demon, Madeline launched a demonic invasion on Earth. X Factor and the X Men teamed up. Wolverine randomly kissed Jean because apparently boundaries are optional. And Jean happily reunited with Storm. During the final confrontation, Jean finally learned Madeline's true origin. She was Sinister's clone of Jean all along. Facing defeat, Madeline tried sacrificing baby Nathan in one last blast. Scott saved him while Madeline died, but not before mentally linking herself to Jean. To survive, Jean absorbed the missing fragment of herself she'd rejected years earlier, along with all of Madeline's and Phoenix's memories. So overnight, Jean gained every memory of the Phoenix, every memory of being Madeline Pryor, cosmic trauma, clone trauma, and somehow even more emotional baggage. Mr. Sinister immediately tried deleting those memories, but Scott seemingly killed him before he could. Afterward, Jean grew incredibly attached to baby Nathan and started wondering whether motherhood was something she wanted. Then X Factor was transported to a war-torn planet awaiting judgment from the Celestials. There, the Phoenix and Madeline personalities battled inside Jean's head until she literally blasted them out of herself, keeping all of their memories while finally reclaiming her own identity. Scott proposed. Jean said no. Not because she didn't love him, but because after surviving cosmic possession, clone drama, fake deaths, real deaths, alternate personalities, demons, and at least one sentient island, she decided she wanted to figure out who Jean Grey actually was before becoming someone's wife. Fair enough, I respect it. She later met Rachel Summers, the daughter of an alternate version of Jean and Scott, so like kinda her daughter, but not really. At first, Jean wanted absolutely nothing to do with a future child she'd never agreed to have, but eventually the two became close, and she made it really known too. Like she was very loud about it, not wanting to be Rachel's mother. I felt bad for Rachel. Then Apocalypse infected baby Nathan with a techno-organic virus. The only way to save him was sending him thousands of years into the future with the Askani. Jean had only just begun thinking of Nathan as her own. Then she had to let him go. Despite more relationship drama, including Psylocke making things super awkward around Scott, Jean and Scott finally committed completely to one another. This time, Jean proposed. Scott wisely said yes. They married at the Xavier Institute and honeymooned in St. Bart's, where future Rachel promptly interrupted them and recruited them into a time travel mission. As you do. Rachel transferred both of their minds into cloned bodies in the 38th century, where they lived as Red and Slim. There, they secretly spent 12 years raising Nathan, finally getting the chance to be the parents they'd lost and the opportunity to become. After defeating that era's Apocalypse, they said goodbye to Nathan once again before returning to the present. Before sending them home, Rachel asked Jean to finally embrace the name Phoenix. This time, Jean accepted it only on her terms. Back in the present, she and Scott joined the fight against the techno-organic phalanx, only to discover that Jean's sister Sarah had been absorbed into the alien collective. Destroying the phalanx saved Earth, but Sarah was apparently lost with it. In Jean Grey's life, even the happy endings usually come with emotional damage. After surviving Onslaught, basically Professor X and Magneto's worst personality trait shoved into one terrifying supervillain, but he's super cool. And then getting hunted by Bastion's Operation Zero Tolerance, Jean and Scott finally did something healthy. They took a vacation. Well, an X-Men vacation. Scott was recovering from serious injuries, so the two disappeared in Alaska. Jean spent the downtime exploring the true limits of her powers and even started wearing a costume inspired by the Phoenix. The same look the Phoenix Force had worn while pretending to be her. Symbolic healing, character growth, all that good stuff. Naturally, it lasted about 10 minutes. Psylocke and the Shadow King had a psychic throwdown so intense that it basically crashed the world's mental Wi-Fi, temporarily shutting down the psionic powers across the entire planet. Once everyone's brains rebooted, Jean and Scott returned to the X-Men, only to discover Xavier had disbanded the team on purpose because he suspected there were infiltrators. Trust issues. The X-Men story. Soon after, a group of adorable nanotech children called the Manites needed protection. Jean, Scott, and Wolverine threw together an emergency team to defend them from Apocalypse's newest horseman, Death, who turned out to be the real Wolverine after being brainwashed by Apocalypse, because apparently Marvel had been using the wrong Wolverine. Then Jean discovered that she was one of the 12, a legendary group of mutants designed to usher in a new golden age. Apocalypse heard this prophecy and immediately thought, I'm gonna steal it. He hijacked the entire plan to make himself even more powerful. During the final battle, Scott sacrificed himself to stop Apocalypse, who immediately possessed Scott's body. So Jean lost her husband without technically losing her husband. Like I said, comic books, man. Thankfully, Jean and Cable eventually freed Scott from Apocalypse's control, but being possessed by one of history's biggest monsters leaves emotional scars. Scott came back colder, angrier, and generally less fun to be around. Their marriage started falling apart, but neither of them actually dealt with it because there were always about 14 world-ending emergencies waiting in line. Jean instead became acting headmistress of Xavier's school after Professor X left for space. What nobody realized was that Xavier had secretly been body snatched by his evil psychic twin, Cassandra Nova. Yes, Professor X had an evil sister that no one else knew existed, and apparently she was the evil one, not him. Just roll with him. While fighting the mutant organ harvesting U-Men, which is exactly as horrifying as it sounds, Jean's connection to the Phoenix erupted dramatically. A giant flaming psychic bird exploded behind her. The full Phoenix visually everyone knows, and all of her teammates collectively went, oh no. Ironically, embracing the growing power actually helped Jean become more confident. Instead of worrying about Scott pulling away, she finally started feeling comfortable in her own skin. Then Cassandra Nova made everyone's lives significantly worse. To save Xavier, Jean literally downloaded his entire consciousness into her own mind, then used Cerebra to temporarily upload fragments of Xavier's psyche into every mutant on Earth until his body could be recovered. Just casually becoming psychic cloud storage, I guess. After Cassandra was defeated, Xavier and Jean began studying her rapidly growing abilities and realized the Phoenix Force wasn't just connected to her. It was actively manifesting inside her mind again. Meanwhile, Scott made an incredibly questionable life choice. Trying to work through his trauma, he asked Emma Frost for telepathic therapy, as I mentioned before. The therapy turned into a psychic affair. Jean found out. This went poorly. Instead of punching Emma, which honestly would have been simpler, Jean physically forced Emma to relive every painful failure and bad memory she's ever experienced. Therapy was canceled. Jean only calmed down after reading Scott's memories herself and confirming that technically he never physically cheated. Later, when Emma's diamond body was shattered during an assassination attempt, Jean actually used the Phoenix Force to put Emma back together again. Because Jean Grey contains multitudes. Then came the Magneto crisis. Except it wasn't Magneto. It was Scorn, or Zorn, pretending to be Magneto. Comics remain committed to keeping things as confusing as possible. Zorn trapped Jean and Wolverine aboard a space station and launched them straight into the sun while he conquered New York. Facing certain death, Wolverine made the hardest decision imaginable. He killed Jean. His logic was simple. If we're both about to burn alive, at least she won't suffer. Unfortunately, killing Jean activated the Phoenix. She immediately resurrected, shrugged off being murdered, rescued Wolverine, and flew back to Earth. There, during the final battle, Zorn unleashed a devastating electromagnetic pulse that killed Jean again. This time, the Phoenix Force itself shattered into billions of fragments. Jean was buried at Xavier's school. Her consciousness, however, graduated to a higher plane of existence. Death continued to be more of a scheduling inconvenience than a permanent condition. While recovering inside the mysterious White Hot Room, essentially the Phoenix Force Cosmics repair shop, the Shi'ar decided the safest solution was to forcibly resurrect the Phoenix so they could destroy it permanently. This plan went about as well as you'd expect. The forced resurrection drove the Phoenix insane. Looking for a way to heal itself, it initially searched for Scott, hoping his optic blast could somehow recharge it. Instead, it found Jean's grave. Naturally, it resurrected her. Jean immediately resisted. Wolverine immediately killed her again. The Phoenix immediately resurrected her again. This became a deeply unhealthy cycle. Eventually, after enough repeated deaths weakened the Phoenix's grip, Jean managed to drag herself beneath the Arctic ice and bury herself alive just to keep the Phoenix away from everyone else, which is certainly one way to establish boundaries. The Phoenix abandoned Jean and possessed Emma Frost instead. The X-Men locked Phoenix Emma inside a special containment chamber. The chamber lasted about as long as every other X-Men prison. Once the Phoenix escaped, it confronted Jean again after the X-Men rescued her from the ice. This time, the Phoenix finally accepted reality. Jean wasn't just another host, she was the host. The Phoenix reunited fully with Jean, but after witnessing how deeply the X-Men genuinely loved her, it chose compassion instead of destruction. It even shielded the team from a Shi'ar superweapon meant to annihilate it. After sharing one final moment with Scott, Jean convinced the Phoenix that they both needed to stop fighting and simply heal. Together, they returned to the White Hot Room. Later, Madeline Pryor returned as a psychic ghost, looking to steal Jean's body. The X-Men, apparently thinking several moves ahead for once, had secretly swapped Jean's corpse with a random body. Madeline possessed the decoy. It immediately exploded her consciousness. Identity theft unsuccessful. Eventually, bizarre psychic events started happening worldwide. Giant flaming birds appearing in the sun. The moon exploded. Everyone collectively sighed because they knew exactly whose fault it probably was. Sure enough, the Phoenix Force had returned. So had Jean. Except she was quietly living in suburbia, eating at diners, and minding her own business, like she wasn't doing nothing to nobody. The X-Men sent an alternate universe Wolverine to investigate because regular Wolverine wasn't confusing enough. He discovered Jean had unknowingly been living inside a fantasy created by the Phoenix. The Phoenix appeared as its iconic flaming bird, offering Jean everything she'd ever lost, including Scott, who had died from the Terrigen Mist exposure. Jean made the hardest decision imaginable. Rather than accept a perfect illusion, she rejected it. She even killed that version of Scott the Phoenix offered her, choosing real grief over fake happiness. Couldn't be me. The Phoenix finally understood. Its flames quietly faded from Jean's hands, and for once, Jean won by saying no. Later, while battling the time-traveling mutant Ahab, Jean unexpectedly inherited all of the memories of her younger, time-displaced self, finally closing one of the X-Men's many, many time-traveling paradoxes. Then Nate Gray, the alternate reality son of Jean and Scott from the Age of Apocalypse storyline, rewrote reality using a life seed, creating a peaceful utopia where mutants were forbidden from forming romantic relationships. Because love is now illegal. Jean secretly fell in love with Bishop, which was weird. The government erased Bishop and wiped Jean's memories, but she couldn't shake this feeling that something was missing. Eventually, clues, including Bishop's personal belongings, helped Jean remember everything. She learned Nate had manufactured this entire reality. After confronting him, Nate finally accepted that this perfect world wasn't actually perfect and erased it. Back in the real world, Jean reclaimed her original codename, Marvel Girl. Then the Krakoan era. Professor X, Magneto, and Myra McTaggart founded the Mutant Nation of Krakoa, and Jean joined the new Mutant Society alongside practically everyone else. Almost immediately, the X-Men launched a suicide mission against Orchis, an anti-mutant organization building Mother Mold, the giant AI factory designed to create Nimrod, the mutant extinction machine nobody wanted to meet. The team succeeded. Almost everyone died doing it, though. Jean and Scott barely escaped, until Orchis scientist Dr. Alia Gregor killed Scott in revenge of her husband's death. Jean managed to reach an escape pod. Orchis blew that up too. Mission accomplished. Everyone was dead. Fortunately, Krakoa had recently unlocked what can only be described as the world's most overpowered healthcare plan. Thanks to the Five, a group of mutants whose combined abilities made resurrection possible, and Cerebro, which stored backup copies of mutants' minds, Jean, Scott, and the entire team were grown brand new clone bodies and had their memories restored. So after sacrificing themselves to save mutant kind, everyone came back. The mission was declared a complete success because in the X-Men universe, dying is just a part of the job. After helping found the mutant nation of Krakoa, Jean joined the ruling body, the Quiet Council, where she basically became the team's moral compass. While everyone else debated things like politics, laws, and whether certain supervillains deserved exile forever, Jean was usually the one asking, okay, but have we considered not being awful? She voted on major decisions, helped shape Krakoa's laws, and weighed in on whether irredeemable mutants should be banished. Around this time, Jean and Emma finally did something no one expected. They grabbed drinks together. Years after the whole psychic affair with Scott disaster, the two women actually buried the hatchet. No telepathic fistfights, no mental torture, just beverages and emotional maturity. Which, honestly, that's rarer than resurrection in X-Men comics. Then Professor X was assassinated by infiltrating mercenaries. Fortunately, Krakoa had already invented mutant respawning. Jean helped resurrect Xavier, who immediately thanked her by secretly recruiting her into the X-Force. Nothing says, thanks for bringing me back from the dead, quite like assigning someone into more dangerous missions. Soon after, Jean and Scott's son Cable became trapped in Otherworld. Jean stepped down from the Quiet Council to focus on rescuing him. And afterward, she and Scott decided it was time for a fresh start. Together, they formed a brand new X-Men team. Instead of Xavier handpicking everyone for once, the roster was chosen through a public election during the very first Hellfire Gala. Democracy for superheroes. The new team barely had time to settle in before dealing with threats like Night and the gloriously named space pirate fungus guy, Cordyceps Jones, proving once again that comic books fear absolutely no naming conventions. Then the Eternals showed up. Specifically, Druig decided mutants were actually deviant, which means they needed to be exterminated. As if that wasn't enough. The giant celestial, known as the Progenitor, arrived to settle things. Instead, it decided to judge literally everyone on Earth. Giant space gods love surprise performance reviews. The Progenitor, I feel like I'm saying that wrong. Oh, well, who cares? The Progenitor started passing judgment on humanity one person at a time. And if you failed, you died. Jean failed. And guess what happened? The Celestial judged her for the time she'd been cruel, for losing control as the Phoenix, and for destroying the entire civilization, which is fair. Except the Progenitor had also been casually killing Earth's heroes while judging everyone else. Jean basically looked up at the giant cosmic god and said, "You really going to lecture me about mass murder?" Standing alongside Tony Stark, she called out the Celestial's hypocrisy. Tony encouraged it to actually live up to its standards it demanded from everyone else. Shockingly, it worked. The Progenitor started questioning whether it deserved to judge anyone. The Eternal Ajax decided it didn't. The Celestial essentially failed its own test, resurrecting everyone it had killed, and handed its immense power over to Ajax instead. Jean came away from the whole experience with one big realization. If mutants can resurrect people, why are we keeping this to ourselves? So she established the Phoenix Foundation, a humanitarian effort that used Krakoa's resurrection technology to bring back people who had died from illness, starting with children. For once, resurrection wasn't just for superheroes. Then Madeline Pryor came back again. Now ruling Limbo, Madeline invaded New York, and Jean prepared yet another emotionally exhausting showdown with her clone. Except this time, Madeline didn't want revenge. She wanted memories. Specifically, she wanted Jean's memories of raising Nathan, the moments Madeline had never gotten to experience herself. Jean simply gave it to her, which she should. No giant battle, no psychic cage match, just empathy. Madeline got the memory she'd always longed for and peacefully came off the invasion. Honestly, that's probably the healthiest conversation either of them have ever had. And to this day, have ever had. Unfortunately, peace never lasts. Nightmare returned looking for revenge and manipulated events into another conflict involving the Brood. Jean wanted to save them, but Scott wanted to wipe them out permanently. For one of the first time in years, the two found themselves on completely opposite sides of a moral argument. Jean believed even the Brood deserved a chance to change. Scott believed the galaxy had already given them too many chances. Their compromise was to leave the Brood under the supervision of their ally, Broo, a Brood who had proven they weren't all monsters. Even so, the disagreement drove a wedge between Jean and Scott. Not long after, Jean left the X-Men. Then came the third Hellfire Gala, which immediately turned into a disaster. Orchis launched a full-scale surprise attack with Nimrod leading the assault. Jean threw up enormous telekinetic shield, protecting as many people as she could while the mutants fought for their lives. Then Myra McTaggart killed her. Even while dying, Jean managed one brilliant last move. She tricked an Orchis operative into believing Firestar had genuinely betrayed the X-Men and joined Orchis. In reality, Firestar remained a double agent all along. Jean's final act was setting up one of X-Men's biggest future advantages. Then, mortally wounded, she shared one last goodbye with Scott, who had been fatally injured. Because even mutant galas can't just be fancy parties. They always end in some kind of apocalypse, something crazy. Now, in the more recent life of Jean Grey and currently in the comics, let's talk about what Marvel's most busiest mutant has going on. Now, fully embracing the Phoenix, Jean has basically promoted herself from Earth's resident telepath to full-time cosmic crisis manager. With practically unlimited powers at her fingertips, she decided her new purpose was simple: fix the universe. So she started flying around the galaxies, preventing disasters, saving civilizations, and generally doing the kind of stuff that would make Superman say, all right, that's a bit much. Scott, meanwhile, has one very understandable concern. His wife has become an immortal cosmic fire goddess. Long-distance relationships are hard without one person literally becoming an eternal universal force. Scott worried she might never come back, which is fair. Jean reassured him that she wasn't abandoning Earth forever. She just needed time to figure out this whole being the Phoenix thing. Once she understood it and herself, she'd come home. She'd promised their bond wouldn't change. Across the cosmos, though, Jean quickly discovered that having the Phoenix's reputation was less than ideal. To Jean, she was saving lives. To everyone else, she was that Phoenix, the one with a history of accidentally eating stars. Fortunately, she found at least one friend in Nova, a human rocket and intergalactic police officer. While helping Nova stop a prison break at Kylan 2, Jean stabilized a nearby black hole to keep the prison from being destroyed and to protect both guards and prisoners. The good news is millions of people lived. The bad news is one dangerous inmate escaped. That inmate was Pericus, one of the ancient dark gods, which is a giant oops. Pericus crash-landed on a remote planet where his arrival ruined the life of a young member of the Universal Church of Truth named Adani. She blamed the Phoenix for everything that happened to her and swore revenge. Because even when Jean saves millions of people, someone has a vendetta about it. Jean kept answering distress calls across the space until she ran into Corsair, who is Scott's dad and captain of the Starjammers. So yeah, Scott's father is a space pirate. We just accept it. Corsair told Jean that Thanos' Black Order had kidnapped people from Game World and forced them into slavery on a frozen moon. Jean rushed in to help. Instead of finding the Black Order alone, she got attacked by an army of undead Asgardian warriors, naturally. Rather than simply blasting them apart, Jean realized they were trapped souls. She compassionately released them from their undead torment, allowing them to finally rest in peace before driving off the Black Order. Unfortunately, all of this incredible, impressive heroism attracted exactly the wrong audience. Gore the God Butcherer noticed. If your job description is literally kill gods, then a giant cosmic phoenix flying around saving galaxies is basically your dream target. Gore challenged Jean, they fought, and he actually killed her. Again. Jean responded the way Jean Grey usually responds to death. She got better. The phoenix rose from the ashes and appeared before Eternity, who basically offered her a promotion to join the abstract cosmic entities representing universal concepts. Jean politely declined becoming management. Instead, she returned, defeated Gore, and rather than killing him, collapsed him into himself and transformed him into a star. Congratulations. You're now literally fueling life instead of ending it. And that's what we call poetic justice. Meanwhile, Pericus has been busy turning Adani into a powerful warrior fueled by hatred. He also convinced the Galactic Council that maybe this whole Phoenix situation had gotten a little out of hand. Unfortunately for them, Jean is psychic. She simply showed up in the middle of their secret meeting before they could even finish discussing her. Unfortunately, again, Adani immediately attacked her using a sword forged in the Quarry of Creation, a weapon capable of harming even the Phoenix. While Jean fought Adani, Pericus struck another deal. He offered the Galactic Council a way to stop the Phoenix, if Thanos became their leader. Clearly, nothing could go wrong. It went exactly as wrong as you'd expect. Thanos took control and immediately spread death and suffering across the universe. Jean blamed herself. Her attempt to do good had accidentally helped put the Mad Titan in charge. So she assembled her own cosmic Avengers. Nova brought experience, Captain Marvel handled strategy, Rocket handled technology, and probably complained the whole time. Lady Sif handled hitting things with alarming efficiency, and together they went after Thanos. Unfortunately, Thanos had the mystical Warlock's Eye, which hid him from the Phoenix itself. Jean had to read Adani's memories just to locate him. When she finally confronted Thanos, the whole thing turned out to be a trap. Using the Warlock's Eye, his connection to death, Thanos actually overpowered the Phoenix and began corrupting its life-giving power. With no other choice, Jean made an enormous sacrifice. Still physically linked to Adani, she transferred the Phoenix's full cosmic power into her former enemy just long enough to escape Thanos' control. It worked. Mostly. The Phoenix's overwhelming power immediately started corrupting Adani instead. Jean herself was forced into a dormant state inside a mysterious cosmic pod, though she managed to hold on to a tiny fragment of the Phoenix Force. While sleeping, Jean basically went into therapy. Cosmic therapy. Inside her own soul, she wrestled with everything she'd become, her humanity, her responsibilities, and whether someone as emotional as her should wield infinite power. But she finally emerged. But the Phoenix had changed. It was no longer just a force of destruction and rebirth. It had evolved into something new, a true guardian of creation. Unfortunately, while Jean was busy achieving enlightenment, Pericus manipulated Adani into freeing the imprisoned dark gods who planned to seize the Phoenix and remake reality into eternal darkness. It was a bit of a setback. Jean confronted Adani again. During their battle, she discovered she could now wield the energies of the Shadow Realm, and the fight eventually spilled into the nexus of all realities, because apparently normal battlefields are no longer exciting enough. At the decisive moment, Jean faced a choice. She could unleash all her rage and obliterate the dark gods, or she could save Adani. I think we know where this is going. She saved Adani. Because no matter how powerful the Phoenix became, Jean refused to lose the empathy that made her human. That decision broke the Dark Gods' plans. They were banished. The Galactic Council was freed from Thanos' control. The balance of the universe was restored, not by overwhelming force, but by compassion. Then something happened that genuinely shocked Jean. While flying through deep space, she suddenly heard a familiar psychic voice. It was her sister, Sarah Gray. Considering Sarah had been dead for years, this was unexpected. Jean tried accessing the white-hot room to investigate, but discovered it was somehow unreachable. Instead, Sarah herself appeared and brought Jean into Greyhaven, which is a sanctuary where dormant mutants awaken their powers. It turned out Sarah had been resurrected and had become a latent mutant whose ability was awakening mutant gifts in others. Jean barely had time to process this before Cable showed up and immediately attacked Sarah. Family reunions can be complicated. Cable insisted Sarah wasn't real. According to him, she was an impossible anomaly, a manifestation of the Phoenix's desire to have her family back, and keeping her alive would destroy the timeline. He even showed Jean a catastrophic future caused by Sarah's continuing existence. Jean listened, she thought about it, and she said no. She refused to sacrifice her sister out of fear. That decision led her into the White Hot Room, back at home, where she encountered abstract beings like the In-Betweener, who accused her of upsetting the balance of existence simply because she was too human. One by one, the abstract entities argued that Jean's compassion made her unfit to wield the Phoenix. Apparently, gods aren't supposed to have feelings, like whatsoever. Jean answered by summoning previous Phoenix hosts to stabilize while the collapsing White Hot Room itself. Then Oblivion prepared to erase her from existence, but Sarah stepped in. She argued that humanity wasn't a flaw, it was exactly what the universe needed. Instead of dying, Sarah was transformed into Beacon, a cosmic herald whose purpose was reminding abstract gods not to lose touch with compassion. Jean finally got to keep her sister, and it really was one of the happier endings she's ever had. Now fully at peace with herself and completely in control of Phoenix, Jean planned to stay among the stars for a very long time. Then she got interrupted. Again. A powerful psychic signal from Earth reached her. A brand new mutant called the Creationist desperately needed help. Remembering her promise to Scott that she wouldn't stay in space forever, Jean came home. The Creationist, formerly a traumatized young man named Bobby from Haven House in Louisiana, had developed reality warping powers that turned artists' creation into actual monsters, which was an extremely stressful way to discover you like drawing. Instead of fighting him, Jean entered his mind. She uncovered the abuse and trauma that had shaped his life and realized monsters weren't really coming from his powers. They were coming from his fear. By helping Bobby confront the fear, instead of running from it, Jean helped him undo all the destruction he'd caused. Rather than treating him as another dangerous mutant to lock away, she invited him to join the X-Men. Because after everything Jean Grey had survived, cosmic gods, clones, deaths, resurrections, space dictators, sentient firebirds, and enough trauma to fill several timelines, she still believed the same thing she'd always believed, that every mutant deserves a chance to belong. And that is Jean Grey from start to finish, from her first time in Marvel Comics to currently. And I'm really tired. I have been talking for a long time, so I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Do me a favor, be sure to share this episode with your friends so I didn't just talk for over an hour in vain. With that being said, I hope you'll like and subscribe, and I hope you have a marvelous day.